The image we have of the Roman Empire is one of a beautiful period characterized by happiness, mirth, technological progress, and thinkers. However, this era wasn't as kind to its women as we might have imagined. The punishments imposed upon Roman women didn't always fit their crimes. So, how were women treated in the era of the Roman Empire? What sorts of punishments did they endure? Did any of them survive these tortures? Why did they even get punished? You'll find answers to these questions in this video. Medical experimentation. While it's true that the ancient Romans were known for their significant contributions to the fields of architecture, military strategy, and government, it's also necessary to remember that, like many ancient cultures, they had a darker side. One example of this is the practice of human experimentation on slaves, a practice that may seem shocking to our modern sensibilities. To give a bit of context, slavery was an integral part of Roman society, with slaves constituting a significant proportion of the population. Slaves were not regarded as full human beings in the eyes of the law, but rather as property that could be bought, sold, and used as their owners saw fit. This dehumanizing perspective led to a host of injustices, one of which was the use of slaves for medical experimentation. Roman medicine was a curious blend of science, superstition, and trial and error. While some Roman doctors did adhere to the Hippocratic Oath, an ancient Greek code of ethics that included a promise to do no harm to patients, others took a less scrupulous approach. These doctors saw slaves as a ready supply of test subjects for their medical research. Why bother with animals when you have a human right there, right? That must have been the thought process. And who better to use than someone considered expendable, someone who couldn't say no? It was a grim reality, to say the least. There are accounts, for instance, of doctors performing surgeries on slaves without the use of anesthetics. Can you imagine the horror of being forced to undergo a procedure, feeling every cut, every stitch, all while being unable to move or cry out? Then there were the experiments involving drugs and potions. Roman medicine was heavily influenced by the Greeks, and one of the things they inherited was a fascination with pharmaceuticals. Many of these concoctions were untested, and the effects they had on the human body were largely unknown. Slaves were the guinea pigs in these dangerous trials, made to swallow mysterious liquids and inhale strange fumes to see what would happen. The details about specific incidents are sparse, as the Romans didn't keep extensive records of these practices. However, the case of the famous physician Galen stands out. Galen was one of the most prominent medical practitioners of the Roman Empire and made significant contributions to the field, including the understanding of anatomy and the circulatory system. However, he also carried out dissections and vivisections, often on animals, but there is evidence that suggests he may have used slaves for some of these procedures as well. Physical and emotional abuse. The harsh realities of life for a Roman slave were indeed unimaginably brutal, with physical, sexual, mental, and emotional abuse being common. Slaves were seen as property rather than people, and their masters could subject them to all manner of abuses without repercussions. Imagine being in a place where your body isn't your own, and where anyone can hurt you at any time. That was the life of a Roman slave. Even the smallest mistake could result in a whipping. They were often left with scars on their backs from the harsh punishment. And it wasn't just whipping. Some masters tortured their slaves in unimaginably cruel ways. They could be burned, mutilated, or even killed for serious offenses. All of this with little to no repercussions, since slaves were seen as property, not people. Slaves were often branded or mutilated to mark them as property. Picture the searing pain of a branding iron or the horrifying experience of being mutilated as punishment. And then there was the sexual exploitation. This is a hard topic to talk about, but it's an important part of the reality for many slaves. Masters often used their slaves for their own sexual pleasure, not caring about their feelings or consent. This wasn't only a problem for female slaves, but also for males. They had no say in this, and refusing was not an option. If a master wanted something, they took it, regardless of how it might affect the slave. Hard labor and horrifying lifestyles. When it came to labor, slaves were made to do back-breaking work, often in dreadful conditions. From toiling in the fields under the hot sun, to working in poorly ventilated mines, to performing household chores from dawn till dusk, the work was ceaseless and grueling. Overworking was common, with many slaves being worked to death, especially those who labored in mines or large agricultural estates. Living conditions for slaves were horrific as well. Many were crammed into small, dingy spaces with little to no privacy. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. Disease was common, and medical care was minimal if it existed at all. The Romans didn't just see slaves as individuals, but as pieces in their wealth puzzle. If it benefited them, they'd sell a child, a mother, or a father, tearing apart families with no regard for their relationships. Imagine the heartache of a mother seeing her child being taken away, or a child watching their parents sold to a different master. The Romans didn't care about these feelings. They only cared about their profit. Gladiatorial combat and forced death. Life as a gladiator was no glamorous affair. It was often a death sentence. Slaves were forced to fight, sometimes to the death, for the amusement of the Roman citizens. You've probably heard of Spartacus, who was a slave trained to be a gladiator. He managed to escape with about 70 other slaves and started a revolt against the Roman Republic. His revolt grew into an army of around 120,000 men, women, and children. They managed to withstand or defeat the Roman military multiple times, even trained Roman legions under consular command. However, the revolt was eventually crushed by the Roman Senate, who fielded an army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus. The slaves were defeated, and around 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way. There are also accounts of slaves who gained notoriety in different ways. Volumnia Cytheris was a famous actress and courtesan who later became a freedwoman. Pope Clement I and Pope Calixtus I, both former slaves, rose to become significant religious figures. Marcus Tullius Tiro, a former slave of Cicero, is known for publishing Cicero's works and possibly inventing an early form of shorthands. Another one of the most brutal aspects of Roman slavery was the humiliation and degradation that slaves had to endure. They were often forced to perform tasks that were considered beneath the dignity of free citizens, a daily reminder of their low status in society. In addition to this, slaves were required to wear specific clothing that marked them as slaves, a clear visual symbol of their inferior position. Imagine walking around with a label that screams, "I'm a slave," to everyone you pass. Now, let's go even darker. Picture this. A master dies under suspicious circumstances. As an act of collective punishment, all of their slaves, innocent or not, could be forced to commit suicide. Yes, you heard it right. The twisted logic behind this was that if any slave was guilty of murder, then all could potentially be guilty. This is illustrated by a case described by the historian Tacitus, where 400 slaves owned by a high-ranking official were sentenced to death after one of them was accused of murdering their master. This wasn't an isolated incident. Collective punishment was a common practice in Roman society. The Romans didn't see slaves as individuals with their own thoughts and feelings, but as a collective property. When one malfunctioned, they believed that the rest were also faulty and needed to be discarded. It's a horrifying thought, yet it happened in reality. It's a stark reminder of how cruel humans can be to each other. This wasn't just a part of history, it was a systemic, ingrained part of Roman society that lasted for hundreds of years. Slavery was an institution of power and control, a tool to keep the masses in check while the elite reaped the benefits. It's a grim chapter in our history, but one that we must remember to ensure that such atrocities never happen again.